Carl Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't about controlling anger. It was about people who seemed immune to emotional triggers and the psychological transformation that made them that way. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. Jung never taught emotional control. What he discovered was far more profound and far more disturbing than simple anger management. In his clinical practice in Zurich, Jung documented patients who had undergone a specific psychological metamorphosis. These individuals remained mysteriously calm when provoked, unbothered by criticism, and seemingly immune to the emotional manipulations that controlled everyone else. They didn't suppress their emotions, they didn't practice detachment techniques. They had achieved something Jung called psychological wholeness through shadow integration, and it gave them an almost supernatural ability to remain centered while others spiraled into emotional chaos. Today, I'll reveal Jung's actual framework for achieving this state, the historical figure who embodied it most completely, and a psychological process that can transform anyone from emotionally reactive to psychologically whole. But I must warn you, what Jung discovered challenges everything we think we know about anger, emotions, and human nature itself. The case that changed everything began not with a patient, but with Jung himself. The discovery began not with a patient, but with Jung himself. In 1913, following his bitter split with Sigmund Freud, Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For 6 years, he was bombarded with visions, dreams, and emotional storms that would have destroyed most men. His colleagues thought he was having a psychotic break. His family feared for his sanity. But Jung did something remarkable. Instead of suppressing these experiences or seeking to control them, he documented everything in what would become the Red Book. He dialogued with his visions. He painted the images that emerged from his unconscious. He allowed himself to be completely vulnerable to the chaos within, while maintaining a thread of consciousness that observed without judgment. And through this process, Jung made a shocking discovery. The emotions that threatened to overwhelm him, the anger and fear and despair, weren't attacking him from outside. They were split-off parts of his own psyche demanding recognition. What appeared to be external enemies were internal fragments, crying out for integration. Jung emerged from this crisis not by conquering his emotions, but by befriending them. And he had discovered the secret that would define his entire psychological system. Consciousness transforms what suppression only amplifies. Jung gave a name to this phenomenon. He called it the shadow. Jung gave a name to this phenomenon. He called it the shadow. But here's what most people misunderstand. The shadow isn't just your negative qualities. It's everything about yourself you've disowned, denied, and projected onto others. Jung wrote, "The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors." But the shadow does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. Think about that. Your shadow contains not just your capacity for cruelty, but your capacity for passion. Not just your selfishness, but your healthy self-interest. Not just your anger, but your appropriate boundaries. And here's where Jung's discovery becomes disturbing. Every person who triggers your anger is showing you your own shadow. That co-worker who's always seeking attention, they're reflecting your own disowned need for recognition. That friend who's perpetually late, they're mirroring your own suppressed desire for freedom. That family member whose criticism cuts so deep, they're exposing your own harsh inner judge. Jung put it simply. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But there's a mechanism at work here that most people never understand. Jung called it projection. When we can't accept certain qualities in ourselves, we unconsciously project them onto others, and then we react with disproportionate anger when we see those qualities reflected back at us. The person who rages about other people's greed is often sitting on their own unacknowledged avarice. The person who can't stand laziness in others is suppressing their own exhaustion. The person triggered by someone's arrogance hasn't integrated their own healthy pride. This is why the same behavior that enrages you leaves another person completely unbothered. It's not about the behavior itself. It's about what that behavior is forcing you to see about yourself. But Jung's discoveries went deeper still. He identified something he called complexes, feeling-toned clusters of psychological energy that act like autonomous personalities within your psyche. But Jung's discoveries went deeper still. He identified something he called complexes, feeling-toned clusters of psychological energy that act like autonomous personalities within your psyche. Jung wrote, "Everyone knows nowadays that people have complexes. What is not so well known, though far more important theoretically, is that complexes can have us. Think about the last time you lost it. You weren't yourself. Something took over. You said things you didn't mean. You felt possessed by an emotion you couldn't control. Jung would say a complex had you. Here's how it works. Buried in your unconscious are these emotionally charged clusters, formed around early wounds, unmet needs, and split-off parts of your personality. When something in the present resonates with that old wound, the complex activates. Jung called this constellation of a complex. And when a complex is constellated, you are no longer in conscious control. Jung described it vividly. In an emotion, as the word denotes, you are moved away, you are cast out, your decent ego is put aside, and something else takes your place. We say he is beside himself, or the devil is riding him, or what has gotten into him today, because he is like a man who is possessed. This is why you can't just decide not to get angry. Your ego, your conscious will, isn't in charge when a complex is activated. You're possessed by an autonomous fragment of your psyche that has its own agenda, its own emotions, its own reactions. Most people live their entire lives at the mercy of these complexes, reacting unconsciously to triggers they don't understand, possessed by emotions they can't control. They're puppets dancing on strings they can't even see. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. Consciousness dissolves possession. To understand Jung's framework in action, we need to examine someone who tested it under the most extreme conditions imaginable. To understand Jung's framework in action, we need to examine someone who tested it under the most extreme conditions imaginable, not in a meditation hall or therapist's office, but in humanity's darkest hour. In 1942, a successful Viennese psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was arrested by the Nazis. For the next 3 years, he would survive 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz. His wife, parents, and brother would all perish. He would endure starvation, torture, disease, and the constant presence of death. By every measure, Frankl should have been destroyed, broken, consumed by rage and despair. Instead, something extraordinary happened. In the midst of unimaginable suffering, Frankl made a discovery that would validate everything Jung was teaching about consciousness and wholeness. He found that his captors could control everything about him, except one thing, his inner response to their brutality. Frankl wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." But here's what makes Frankl's case so disturbing and so relevant. He wasn't just philosophizing, he was conducting a real-time psychological experiment in hell itself. And what he discovered matches Jung's framework perfectly. Frankl observed that survival in the camps wasn't determined by physical strength. The strongest men often died first. Survival depended on something psychological, the ability to find meaning even in meaningless suffering. Those who could maintain an inner world separate from outer circumstances were the ones who survived. He watched fellow prisoners react to the same brutalities in completely different ways. Some descended into animalistic rage and despair. Others maintained an almost supernatural equanimity. The difference? Those who remained psychologically whole had unconsciously achieved what Jung called individuation. Frankl himself demonstrated this in a moment that reveals the power of consciousness over emotion. One day, while marching in the freezing cold, on frostbitten feet, being beaten by guards, he suddenly had a vision. He imagined himself in a warm lecture hall after the war, teaching about the psychology of the concentration camp. He saw himself explaining to students the very suffering he was experiencing in that moment. This wasn't dissociation. This wasn't denial. This was what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to step outside your immediate emotional state and observe it from a higher perspective. Frankl had found the gap between stimulus and response that Jung's framework describes. The parallel to Jung's psychology is striking. Jung wrote about shadow integration as the path to wholeness. Frankl was forced to confront humanity's collective shadow, the absolute worst of what humans are capable of. And rather than being destroyed by it or projecting all evil onto his captors, he integrated the knowledge that this capacity for cruelty exists within all humans, including himself. Jung taught that projection creates emotional reactivity. Frankl demonstrated the withdrawal of projections in real time. When he could see his guards as wounded humans acting from their own psychological fragmentation rather than as pure evil, his rage transformed into something else, a deep understanding of human suffering. This didn't make him passive, it made him psychologically free. His captors could control his body, but they couldn't control his inner world. They could trigger his pain, but they couldn't trigger his core identity. He had achieved what Jung described as a consciousness detached from the world that remains beyond the reach of emotional entanglements and violent shocks. But here's the most important part. Frankl didn't enter the camps as a psychologically immune Superman. He was transformed by the experience through the same process Jung mapped. He faced his shadow, his own capacity for hatred, for giving up, for becoming like his oppressors. He withdrew his projections, recognizing the wounded humanity, even in Nazi guards. He found meaning what Jung would call the self that transcended his ego's suffering. After liberation, Frankl could have spent his life consumed by rage. Instead, he founded an entire school of psychotherapy based on his discovery. Logotherapy, the therapy of meaning. He taught that neurosis comes from a lack of meaning, just as Jung taught that neurosis comes from a lack of wholeness. Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This is Jung's framework, proven in the most extreme laboratory imaginable. Frankl demonstrated that even in hell, consciousness can transform your relationship with suffering. Even facing absolute evil, you can remain psychologically whole. Even when everything is taken from you, no one can take your inner freedom. This is what Jung meant by psychological wholeness. Not the absence of suffering, but the presence of consciousness strong enough to contain it. Not emotional immunity, but integration so complete that even the worst triggers cannot fragment you. So how does someone achieve this state? Jung's framework reveals a specific process. And here's what makes it disturbing. It requires you to do exactly what your ego most wants to avoid. You must turn toward your shadow, not away from it. Jung described this journey through several interconnected processes. Recognition, admitting the shadow exists. The first step is admitting the shadow exists. This sounds simple, but it's psychologically brutal. It means acknowledging that you're capable of everything you judge in others. The cruelty, the selfishness, the dishonesty. It's all in you too. Jung warned, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Most people never make it past this stage. They prefer the comfortable delusion that they're fundamentally good and others are fundamentally flawed. They'd rather spend their lives reacting to triggers than face what those triggers reveal. Stage 2. Acceptance. Once you recognize your shadow, you must accept it. Not justify it, not rationalize it. Accept it as real. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." This is where most therapeutic approaches fail. They try to eliminate negative traits rather than integrate them. But suppression only strengthens the shadow. What you resist persists. What you repress gains autonomous power. Acceptance means, yes, I have the capacity for violence. Yes, I can be selfish. Yes, I sometimes enjoy others' suffering. Only when you accept these truths can you begin to integrate them consciously. Stage 3, assimilation. Now comes the most demanding stage. Jung called this shadow assimilation. You must consciously work with the shadow material through techniques like active imagination, dream analysis, and honest self-examination. Jung was explicit about this. A complex can be really overcome only if it is lived out to the full. In other words, if we are to develop further, we have to draw to us and drink down to the very dregs what, because of our complexes, we have held at a distance. This doesn't mean acting out shadow impulses. It means bringing them into consciousness, understanding their origins, and integrating their energy. The anger your father never allowed becomes your capacity for healthy boundaries. The selfishness you were shamed for becomes your ability to meet your own needs. During this stage, you practice withdrawing projection. When someone triggers you, you ask, what part of myself is this person showing me? Where do I have this same quality I'm judging in them? A patient of Jung's, Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, demonstrated this process. Pauli came to Jung suffering from severe depression and alcohol dependency. His problem, he had completely repressed his feeling, function, his emotional life in favor of pure thinking and logic. Through years of analysis, working with over 1,300 dreams, Pauli learned to integrate what he'd disowned. The result wasn't that Pauli became emotional in a chaotic way. He became whole. His emotional triggers decreased dramatically because he was no longer fighting half of himself. Stage 4, integration. Integration is where shadow material becomes part of your conscious personality. You're no longer split between the persona you show the world and the secret self you hide. You become whole. Jung observed, the integration of the shadow gives a man body. You become more real, more substantial, more grounded. And paradoxically, you become less reactive. When you own all parts of yourself, others can't trigger you by pointing them out. Think about it. You can only be triggered by accusations that touch a wound. If someone calls you selfish and you've integrated your capacity for healthy self-interest, the accusation has nowhere to land. It's just information about their projection, not a threat to your self-concept. Stage 5, individuation. The final stage Jung called individuation. This is the lifelong process of becoming whole, of developing a conscious relationship between your ego and the self. Jung described individuated people this way. They came to themselves, they could accept themselves, they were able to become reconciled to themselves, and thus were reconciled to adverse circumstances and events. These are the people who seem immune to emotional manipulation, not because they've shut down their emotions, but because they've expanded their consciousness to include everything they once disowned. They don't react to projections because they've withdrawn their own projections. They don't get triggered by complexes because they've become conscious of them. This is what Ramana Maharshi achieved through his death experience. This is what Jung himself achieved through his confrontation with the unconscious. This is what's available to anyone willing to do the terrifying work of turning toward their shadow rather than away from it. But Jung didn't just map this process theoretically. He developed a specific practice for working with overwhelming emotions in real time. He called it active imagination. Here's how it works. When you feel anger rising, instead of suppressing it or expressing it reactively, you step into a third position. You become the observer. Jung wrote, "The art of letting things happen, action through non-action, letting go of oneself as taught by Meister Eckhart, became for me the key that opens the door to the way we must be able to let things happen in the psyche." The practice has 3 elements. First, you pause and create a conscious space. You don't react immediately. You don't try to control the emotion. You simply notice anger is present. Second, You observe the emotion with curiosity. Where is it in your body? What images or memories accompany it? What is this anger trying to tell you? Jung taught that affects carry information. They're not random. They're pointing to something in your unconscious demanding attention. Third, you dialogue with the emotion. This sounds strange, but Jung found it remarkably effective. You might ask, anger, what do you need me to know? And you wait for a response, not from your thinking mind, but from your unconscious. Images might arise, memories might surface, insights might emerge, Jung observed. When an affect is withheld, it is just as isolating and just as disturbing in its effects as the unconscious secret and just as guilt-laden. The goal isn't to eliminate anger, but to transform it through consciousness. You're bringing what was unconscious into awareness. You're integrating what was split off. You're making conscious what was possessing you unconsciously. One of Jung's patients described the shift like this. Before, anger would sweep through me like a storm, and I had no choice but to react. After learning active imagination, I could feel the storm gathering, but I was no longer in the storm. I was watching it, learning from it, choosing how to respond. This is the secret. You're not trying to become someone who never feels anger. You're becoming someone who's no longer possessed by it. Here's what makes Jung's discovery truly disturbing. The path to appearing emotionally immune is through becoming more emotional, not less. Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The people who seem unbothered aren't those who've successfully suppressed their triggers. They're those who've integrated their shadow so completely that triggers have nothing to grab onto. Think about Ramana Maharshi again. He didn't achieve his equanimity by avoiding emotions. He achieved it by dissolving the false self that emotions threaten. When you have no ego image to defend, criticism can't wound you. When you've accepted your shadow, accusations can't shame you. When you're psychologically whole, projections bounce off you like light through glass. This is the paradox Jung discovered. Psychological immunity comes through vulnerability, not armor. Wholeness, not perfection. Integration, not suppression. Most people build walls to keep their shadow out, but those walls become a prison. They spend their lives defending themselves from their own disowned qualities reflected back by others. Every trigger is an attack on their carefully constructed persona. Every criticism threatens to expose what they've spent a lifetime hiding. But the individuated person has no walls. They've already accepted and integrated everything others might accuse them of. So when someone attacks, there's nothing to defend. The accusation passes through them like wind through an empty room. Jung wrote, the acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life. But Jung also warned about the shadow side of this achievement. He observed that people who developed psychological wholeness sometimes lost empathy for those still trapped in reactive patterns. They could become psychologically superior, looking down on others still struggling with their shadows. This is why Jung emphasized that individuation must include what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension, strength and vulnerability, detachment and compassion, consciousness and care. The truly individuated person isn't cold or distant. They've achieved something more difficult. They can remain centered in chaos while still feeling deeply for others. They're not immune to others' suffering. They're immune to others' projections. Ramana Maharshi embodied this perfectly. Despite his unshakable equanimity, he was known for his compassion. He would cry at others' pain even while remaining undisturbed by his own. He had achieved what Jung called compassionate consciousness, the ability to see others clearly without being pulled into their psychological storms. This is the ultimate achievement Jung mapped. Not emotional immunity, but psychological wholeness. Not the inability to feel, but the freedom to choose how you respond. Not detachment from life, but engagement from center. Here's what makes Jung's discovery most disturbing. The vast majority of people will never undertake this work. They'll spend their entire lives as prisoners of their shadows, puppets dancing on strings they refuse to see, reacting unconsciously to projections they won't withdraw. Why? Because shadow work is terrifying. It requires you to admit you're capable of everything you judge in others. It demands you face the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime denying. It asks you to die to your ego identity and be reborn into wholeness. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Most people would rather blame others than face their shadow. They'd rather stay angry than do the work of integration. They'd rather remain emotionally reactive than undergo the transformation individuation requires." But for those willing to take this journey, Jung's framework offers something extraordinary: freedom. The question now is whether you're ready to begin. Not the journey to never feeling anger, but the journey to psychological wholeness. Not the path to emotional suppression, but the path to consciousness. Jung's framework gives you the roadmap. Start noticing your triggers. Every person who provokes an emotional reaction is showing you your shadow. Stop blaming them and start asking, what part of myself am I seeing in them? Work with your projections. When you find yourself judging someone harshly, assume you possess that quality too. Find it in yourself. Own it. Integrate it. Practice active imagination. When strong emotions arise, don't suppress or express reactively. Observe. Dialogue. Learn what your unconscious is trying to tell you. Commit to the long work of shadow integration. This isn't a weekend workshop. It's a lifelong journey toward wholeness. Jung underwent 6 years of intense confrontation with his unconscious. The process doesn't have to be that dramatic, but it does have to be real. Seek what Jung called individuation, not perfection, but wholeness. Not the elimination of your shadow, but its integration. Not emotional control, but consciousness expansion. Remember Jung's insight. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The people who seem immune to emotional triggers haven't eliminated their capacity for anger. They've integrated it so completely that it no longer controls them. They haven't transcended their humanity. They've become more fully human by accepting all of what they are. This is Jung's disturbing discovery. True freedom comes not from never getting angry, but from understanding anger so deeply that you're no longer possessed by it. Not from being unbothered, but from becoming whole. The shadow you're running from is waiting to become your greatest source of strength. The projections you're avoiding are trying to show you home. The emotions you're suppressing are demanding integration. Jung's final insight echoes across a century. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your triggers aren't random. Your reactions aren't inevitable. Your emotions aren't your enemies. They are fragments of your psyche crying out for recognition, integration, and wholeness. The question is, are you ready to answer that call? Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.